Well, good morning and welcome back. We've made it. We've made it. This is the closing keynote of the MER conference. I really hope that you've enjoyed our conference over the last few days. Our virtual experience has been phenomenal, and really can't thank all of the speakers and all of you for attending and sticking with us. If there is any session that you were unable to attend, um, remember that they are all recorded and they'll all be available after the conference. So you have the benefit of seeing all of the sessions at your leisure. So please take advantage of that. So we're going to welcome our next speaker, Trevor Hughes, the President and CEO of the International Association of Privacy Professionals. Seth and I will join you right after that for some closing remarks. I hope you'll stick around for those. And so let's get started. Privacy is a big deal, right? We all hear about the GDPR and the CCPA and Privacy Shield and high trust and HIPAA, and the list goes on and on. Well, we're blessed to have Trevor here today, who's going to talk to us about privacy, where it's come from, where it's going, and what we should be expecting. Trevor is, as I said, the CEO and president of the IAPP, International Association of Privacy Professionals. That's the world's largest comprehensive global information privacy community. It has over 50,000 members. Trevor is a well-known and well-renowned speaker. He has appeared at South by Southwest. He's done TED Talks, RSA, and other privacy and other technology events. He contributes very frequently to a variety of media outlets. He's been featured in the New York Times and Wired magazine and TechCrunch, and he's appeared before the U.S. Congress, the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, British Parliament, and more. But of course, I'm sure the MER conference is the top of Trevor's list for places that he wants to appear. So thank you, Trevor, for joining us. So without further ado, let's welcome virtually to the stage, Trevor Hughes.
Mike, thank you. It is really wonderful to be here with all of you virtually today. Good day to all of you, wherever you may be. I am really happy to be chatting with you today about something certainly that I spend a lot of time working on and thinking about, and that is privacy. In fact, we can't open the paper today without hearing about privacy. And in this current COVID-19 crisis, that's still the same. COVID-19 is actually driving many new privacy issues for us, and we'll explore those a little bit today. But what I wanted to do today was give you a sense of the future of privacy. But like many things in society, we can't really understand where we may be headed without understanding where we have come from. And so in order to understand the future of privacy, I really do believe we have to understand the history of privacy. We have to understand what this issue is, why it means so much today in the digital economy, why it is so vexing and complex, and perhaps understand a little bit about the nature of privacy as a cyclical concern, as an ongoing concern around the world. So, that's the broad structure of our session today. We are going to understand the future of privacy, and we absolutely will get to that. But in order to get to that, we're going to look at a lot of history. There's one other thing that I'm going to do, and that is I'm going to tell you this story in 3 acts, if you will. And each one of those acts is going to be represented by an apple. So the history of privacy, helping us understand the future of privacy, as described in 3 chapters, 3 acts, each represented by an apple. And there's one more thing, and that is that I'll be using a lot of art. Particularly in a virtual environment like this, I have found that a simple visual cue can actually engage someone's mind in a really interactive and powerful way. And so throughout this session, you're going to have the opportunity to see some amazing art, which is always a fun thing to do. But I hope that this art actually provokes and provides a deeper context and understanding for many of the issues of privacy that we're going to be exploring. So let's begin. So I mentioned that we're going to be using art. A historian once said that art precedes the law. And what she meant by that, Mary Beard, what she meant by that was that art as an exploration of societal concerns and issues is an early warning sign of what the law might become. Because it turns out that the law is a very slow process in terms of responding to societal concerns. All you have to do is look at Washington, D.C. and Capitol Hill and Congress today to see how slow and deliberative and in fact gummed up that process can become. However, artists have no such restrictions. They are free to work on the fringes, on the outside edges of societal issues. And so by looking at art, we actually can see what are the societal issues that may actually engage us in future years. And I think that's a really important thing. So, 3 apples, the story of the history of privacy told through art, and that will give us an understanding of the future of privacy. So let's get going with the first apple. And in fact, the first apple is the first apple. It's the apple of Adam and Eve. We know the story well. Eve was tempted by the snake to taste of the apple from the tree of knowledge. She then shared the apple with Adam, and in violating God's law, Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden. Now, it's interesting that it's not until Adam and Eve are sent out of the Garden of Eden that they understand their nakedness, that they were innocent in their nakedness in the Garden of Eden, but after eating the apple, they understand their nakedness. That sense of vulnerability, of nakedness, sits at the core of privacy. In fact, it is indeed a fundamental human truth. This statue is Lely's Venus. It is in the British Museum in London, England, and it is understood to be a Roman copy of a Greek original, and it is Venus bathing. But something interesting has happened in this piece. The sculptor has brought us in to the art. And how has he or she done that? What they've done is they've made us the person who has interrupted Venus in her bath. And like Adam and Eve, Venus understands her nakedness. So what does she do? She does something incredibly human. She covers her nakedness. You see, privacy helps us to put protection around those human vulnerabilities. Sometimes they are associated with our nakedness. Sometimes they are associated with sickness or illness. We seclude ourselves from others during those times. Sometimes it's around certain behaviors, things like sexual activity, romantic activity, toileting and other things. We need privacy because we are vulnerable. So there is a fundamental human truth that is ancient, that goes back to the beginning of human society, associated with a desire to protect our vulnerabilities, and we wrap that in this broad term of privacy. Children understand this too. A good friend, Lori Craner, who heads the privacy engineering program at Carnegie Mellon University, did a program where she asked kindergarten students to do drawings about privacy. And this one child drew a drawing that said, I need privacy when I'm in the bathroom or when I'm getting dressed. This 5-year-old child understood privacy at a very fundamental level as being associated with moments of vulnerability and moments of modesty or nakedness that they needed to protect. Privacy isn't just a bodily function, though. It is also a spatial function. So our homes are built along constructs that provide varying degrees of privacy. And that actually is not a new idea either. There definitely have been varying cultural norms associated with spatial privacy and the amount of privacy that we have in our physical spaces. But here's a wonderful piece by Peter de Hoek, a Dutch Renaissance painter from the 1600s. And this is Woman Delousing a Child. It's also sometimes known as a woman's work, I believe. And it shows exactly that, a mother delousing her child's hair. Now, there are just layers and layers and layers of privacy messages in this story. First of all, Peter de Hoek has given us a very strong line down the center of this piece The door frame and the edge of the wall sort of create that line. To the left side of the piece, we see daylight and an open door and an open window. It represents the openness of society, the engagement with society and the outside world. It is lighter and brighter. On the right side of the piece, we see darkness, we see shadow, we see things that are hidden. And there are all sorts of things that are hidden here. First of all, there's a bed. That's where those pillows are stacked up in the background. In the foreground is actually something called a cack stool, which is a toilet. And then the mother is doing something incredibly intimate. It actually represents a vulnerability. Were the people in the community to know that her daughter had head lice, she may be ostracized, there may be repercussions associated with that. And so this activity is done in private. Peter de Hoek, this Dutch Renaissance master, has given us a beautiful representation of the fact that not only do we need privacy for our bodily vulnerabilities, but we need spaces in which various private activities can occur, whether it's intimacy, whether it's looking after our health and our well-being, whether it is just attending to the necessary functions of being a human being. We need private spaces. It turns out that it's not just physical, though. We have privacy in our bodies for sure. We have privacy in the space around us for sure. But take a look at the third bay of the Sistine Chapel, famously painted by Michelangelo. It's a stunning piece. This is the representation of the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And you'll note something really compelling here. I told you that this was the moment at which Adam and Eve understood their nakedness for the first time, but they're not covering their nakedness. They're not covering their genitals, their nakedness. They're covering their faces and holding away the angel sending them from the Garden of Eden. Why? Because of their shame. It turns out that privacy also has an emotional dimension. We have an interior, an internal construct of privacy, where we have histories, emotions, feelings, ideas, thoughts that are sensitive and private to us. They may create vulnerabilities. And so Adam and Eve are covering their faces in shame because they want to be hidden from their transgression. So privacy has three very powerful dimensions: a bodily dimension, a spatial dimension, and an emotional dimension. And when we say that one word, we can be talking about any one of those things. Privacy is an incredibly complex issue. And here's the good news: it actually gets even more complex. It turns out that in society, we need to share information in order to stitch ourselves together as a society. That means that on a one-to-one basis, we need to create trust in relationships, and certainly that occurs when we are creating our loving relationships, familial relationships, friends, and others, but it also occurs in a business context. It occurs even on the street, in the markets, anywhere you might be. We need to share information with each other. Often, we need privacy wrapped around that sharing of information. And so there is a communicative dimension to privacy. This is, of course, Vermeer, and it is woman in a blue dress reading a letter. And what I love about this in describing the idea of communicative privacy is that this woman is reading a letter. We don't know what the letter says. She's fully dressed, so there's no issue of bodily vulnerability here. She seems to be in a private home, but unlike Peter de Hoek before, Vermeer has put her in front of a sunlit window, so she's facing the outside world. And in fact, there's a map of the big world behind her. Everything suggests that this is an open and transparent moment, and yet, if we were to come around the corner and enter the doorway of this room and see this woman reading this letter in this manner, we would step back. Our social normative values tell us that this is a private moment. She might be reading a letter from a lover. She might be reading a letter from a family member. Someone might be sick. Someone might be at war. Someone might be on a ship on the other side of the world. We don't know. But what we do know, because when we see this, it's a fundamental human truth, is that the communication that is occurring between that letter and this woman is a private matter. that that is something that is intimate to her. So we need privacy in order to create the social bonds that stitch our societies together. And in that manner, privacy has a communicative dimension. We need to find mechanisms that protect privacy as we communicate with one another. So there's not just 3 dimensions, there's 4 dimensions: bodily privacy, spatial privacy, emotional privacy, and communicative privacy. And every time we say that word, we might be talking about one or more of those topics. And as I've shown you, I hope through these various examples, these are not new concepts of privacy. In fact, they are compellingly ancient. Many of them go back thousands and thousands of years. It's notable, it is absolutely notable, that it was soon after the advent of the written word in Iran and Persia in ancient times that we saw the rise of encryption and code. Why? Because we needed to protect communication, that we needed to create a secretive and private communication. Privacy is an ancient matter. Here's a hot tip for all of you when we are traveling again after this crisis. If you ever do find yourself in Amsterdam, I encourage you to visit the Rijksmuseum. It's one of the great museums of the world. And 2 of the pieces of art that I've described to you, Peter de Hoek's Woman Delousing a Child, and then Vermeer's Woman in a Blue Dress Reading a Letter, hang next to each other. So while everybody else at the Rijksmuseum is looking at The Night Watch by Rembrandt, which is actually just behind you as you're looking at these 2 pieces, you can geek out on privacy and go to this wonderful little corner and just absorb it for a while. Okay. I also want to tell you that privacy is not a static function. Privacy, well, it has many manifestations: bodily, spatial, communicative, emotional. It does not rest in time and stay fixed forever. In fact, it is a social normative value. What do I mean by that? Well, it means that privacy emerges from the culture in which it is enabled or found. And as those cultures differ by era, differ by region, by nationality, differ by religious belief, differ as they emerge around the world, so too does privacy shift. And when the outside world changes in some way, when there's a disruption, privacy changes as well. Let me give you an example of that. So the prior slide had Michelangelo and his sculpture of David. It is in Florence in Italy, one of the most famous pieces of art in the world. Of course, David is naked in this piece, and a copy of this statue was made for Queen Victoria in the 1800s. It is now in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And Queen Victoria was so struck by the nakedness of this piece as she walked through and saw it, that she encouraged the museum to create a fig leaf. And it's actually a really big fig leaf because the statue is really big. And so they actually created a fig leaf which hangs on the wall. And when Queen Victoria was to come through the museum, they would hang the fig leaf on the sensitive parts of Michelangelo's David, the copy that's in the Victoria and Albert Museum. In that one instance, we have a perfect example of how the morals of a particular society, the expectations and normative values of a particular society can change our expectations about what is or is not appropriate at any particular moment. Privacy, well, this is wrapped in modesty and nakedness here. Privacy shifts as well, and it shifts based on the mediation of external factors. All right, now let's get into some of the meat of this, because one of those external factors is something that we are dealing with every single day today, and that is technology. And what I want to share with you now is the idea that technology mediates privacy. We could use all sorts of verbs here. Technology disrupts privacy. Technology upends privacy. I want to tell you a story about a disruptive technology, and I want to tell you the story through this gentleman, this absolute amazing character in the history of privacy. This is Louis Brandeis. Louis Brandeis was the son of immigrants, grew up in St. Louis, went to Harvard Law School. While he was at Harvard Law School, he befriended Samuel Warren. Samuel Warren was the son of an industrialist, a business magnate. His father had run one of the largest paper mills in the world. And Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis graduate from law school, number 1 and number 2. Louis Brandeis graduates number 1. Samuel Warren graduates number 2 in their class at Harvard Law School. They then go into practice with each other. A couple of years later, Louis Brandeis is in his office. Samuel Warren comes in and he is deeply aggrieved by a violation of privacy. He is deeply aggrieved by a new technology that had emerged at that moment in time. And he says to Samuel Warren, he says to Louis Brandeis, his partner, we need to make a call for, write about the need for privacy in the face of these technological innovations. And so what do? They actually write a law review article, which has been described as the most famous law review article in history. In 1890, they write The Right to Privacy. And this was one of the first broad, encompassing ideas of privacy as a legal right to be articulated. And so it is a formative piece in the history of privacy. What do Brandeis and Warren say in this piece? Numerous mechanical devices threaten to make good the prediction that what is whispered in the closet shall be proclaimed from the rooftop. What the heck are they talking about here? It turns out that the mechanical device, the technological disruption that so aggrieved privacy for Warren and Brandeis was flexible film. They were responding to the change in privacy in society associated with the advent of, the invention of, the technological disruption of flexible film. You see, photography had been around for some decades at that point, 40 or 50 years by the time 1890 came around. And so it was a well-known phenomenon, but it involved a tripod, big, huge plates, a cape, a big flash. A photograph took an enormous amount of stage production in order for it to occur. George Eastman developed flexible film in the late 1880s and was in the market by 1890 and created the Kodak Brownie camera. And the Kodak Brownie camera, for the first time, made it possible to take pictures using just a small little box, and then you would wind a key and it would advance the photo. That changed the context of privacy, because no longer would there be all this notice in the world, would there be all of this stage production associated with a photo being taken. Rather, a journalist, anyone on the street could take a picture and possibly do it surreptitiously. So technology mediated privacy. Technology disrupted privacy, and there was a disequilibrium. There was an imbalance in privacy in society. Media at the time responded to this. This is Puck magazine. Think of it like a Time magazine of the era. It was a political editorial magazine, which was a tremendously influential magazine in the late 1800s, early 1900s. This is Puck magazine from 1891, so the exact same era. And on the left of this piece, you see a journalist. And what does he have slung over his shoulder? A Kodak Brownie camera. And across the bottom of this piece, you can see it says, "No privacy is sacred from him." The media, along with leading legal scholars, were exploring the idea that privacy had been disrupted, that privacy had been violated. And in fact, he is invading the sanctity of the home. And you can see this Victorian-looking gentleman with his wife behind him reacting to this journalist invading their privacy. So, technology disrupts privacy. New technologies come in, they change the terms of the deal, they upend them, the balance is thrown off, and privacy needs to react. Let's keep going through history though. So that same Louis Brandeis after 1890, continues in legal practice and then becomes a judge, and ultimately is elevated to the US Supreme Court, where he becomes one of the most famous jurists in US jurisprudential history. Louis Brandeis in 1920 was on the Supreme Court when a case came up involving governmental access to communications through a new technological means. What was that technology? Well, it's here. It's the telephone. The telephone had been developed and was gradually making its way around the entire country. In the case of Olmsted in Texas, there was a bootlegger, someone who was selling illegal liquor during Prohibition. And he was taking orders and doing things from the basement of his house on a telephone. And the government realized that if they went down the street a little bit and then plugged into the wires that were coming out of his house, that they could listen to Olmsted as he was bootlegging, and in fact they did. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where Olmsted said, whoa, wait a minute, you didn't have a warrant to get into that communication. And Brandeis said in that case that you should have a right to be let alone, that privacy should be protected, and the government should have a warrant before it invades your communication privacy through this new technology. Unfortunately, for Olmsted, certainly, Brandeis was in the minority in that opinion. He lost. Privacy lost in the Supreme Court in the face of this technological innovation. And the Supreme Court found that there was not a privacy right, that there was not a Fourth Amendment protection around the communication, and that a wiretap was actually permissible without a warrant. What did the media say at the same time? Well, because most people were on party lines, the media explored the idea of privacy being violated with this new technology. Here's Norman Rockwell, of all people. And what is he doing? He's showing us the nosy neighbor listening to a party line. We see it as well in 1955, a couple of decades later. Who else is listening? An expert wiretapper talks about his trade. Louis Brandeis was very clear in the Olmsted case. He was using the same language, the same ideas that he had created with Warren in 1890. And he said, subtler and more far-reaching means of invading privacy have become available to the government. Discovery and invention have made it possible for the government, by means far more effective than stretching upon the rack, far more effective than torture, to obtain disclosure in court of what is whispered in the closet. The exact same language from 1890 and the exact same idea. I hope you're starting to see a trend here. New technology emerges, it disrupts privacy, and incredibly smart people like Brandeis give us these warning signs that we need to be adapting in order to accommodate privacy in this new technological age in which we find ourselves. So that's the first apple. The first apple is the fundamental human truth of privacy, that it is an ancient concept, that it has many manifestations: bodily, communicative, emotional, spatial, that it is something that is not fixed in time, but rather normative. And those normative values get shifted, get buffeted back and forth based on technological disruption, certainly. And Brandeis, one of the great thinkers in the field of privacy, has given us a very clear vision, and that was, when technology disrupts privacy, the law must adapt. Now let's move on to the second apple. The second apple is the apple of revolution. And I'm going to explore the second apple through this man. This man is Alan Turing. Alan Turing is, of course, famous as a data scientist, as a scientist generally. He is incredibly well known for being one of the people in Bletchley Park who helped to break the Enigma code. His work on cracking the Enigma code was represented to save something like hundreds of thousands of lives in the war, and allowed for the war to end as much as a year and a half earlier than it otherwise would. His work in code breaking certainly was one of the most heroic acts during the war. Alan Turing also was one of the earliest computer scientists. In fact, it was his theoretical work that led to the processing of the first computer code in Manchester, England, in the 1940s, 1950s. In many ways, Alan Turing is seen as the father of computer science, and certainly one of the first people to push us into the information revolution. So Alan Turing has kicked off for us in the 1940s and 1950s the rise of computing, the rise of the processing of information, which leads to our current information revolution. Now, in the 1950s, as computers were beginning to emerge, we saw a similar reaction from the media as to what we saw with the telephone and flexible film previously. Here's Time magazine with a big mainframe computer and a government looking at that data. Here's the 1960s Time magazine again, and the all-powerful computer with a brain behind it is consuming massive amounts of information. And then there are businessmen down in the bottom poring over that data as it spits out of the computer. Fast forward to 1967, and this man, Alan Weston, was a professor at Columbia University. He certainly was a student of Louis Brandeis, not actually a student, but had studied him deeply, understood the history of privacy in the United States, and looked at the rise of computing power and realized that there was a new manifestation of privacy that was emerging, and that was information privacy. So along with bodily privacy, communicative privacy, spatial privacy, and emotional privacy, Alan Weston in 1967 writes a book called Privacy and Freedom, where he makes the argument that in this new information revolution, with the rise of computing power, we need to recognize that all of this computing power is creating a new domain of privacy, and that is the idea of information privacy. So Alan Weston gives name to and really is the foundational scholar in the field of information privacy. Soon after he wrote that book, Newsweek, Time magazine, they're saying the same things as media has said over and over and over again. Here's Newsweek from July in 1970. Is privacy dead? In this computer-driven era with enormous amounts of information being collected. You can see the camera, the phone, and the computer, the three technologies that we've discussed, all being part of this death of privacy, as Newsweek is describing it at the time. Well, let's fast forward now to the current age and the digital revolution that we are going through. It is without question that we have seen a tremendous explosion of not only the amount of data that is being created, but the speed with which it is being processed, the ubiquity of the mechanisms to collect that data, and if anything, the velocity of change. And I want to convey that through describing Facebook to you. And I'm going to describe it in perhaps something that sounds like a sympathetic term, and in some sense there is some sympathy that I have here. So Facebook, I believe, is only 16 or 17 years old. It is not a very old company. Facebook now has over 2 billion monthly users. And in fact, in this current COVID-19 crisis, social media access and use has skyrocketed yet again. So that number is probably low. Over 2 billion people, which is to say almost 1/3 of the world's population, 1/4 to 1/3 of the world's population uses Facebook every single month. I want to give you a point of reference on that, and that is that the Christian faith has 2 billion faithful around the world. 2 billion people around the world would describe themselves as being part of a Christian faith. That faith is now 2,000 years old, and over those 2,000 years has had the opportunity to build normative values, rules, structures, architectures, hierarchies, systems of management and control throughout the entire world for that faith. Now, I am not saying that Facebook is a religion. All I'm trying to say is that the Christian faith went from 0 to 2 billion faithful over the course of 2,000 years. Facebook has gone from 0 to over 2 billion monthly users in less than 20 years. And it has had to build the infrastructure of managing that new domain incredibly quickly. So the velocity of change, the velocity of disruption in the digital revolution is perhaps one of the most compelling features. Now, what do we hear in this process? Back in the 1990s, privacy is dead. Just like Newsweek and others before, privacy just keeps dying over and over and over again. Here's Science Magazine from 2015. So relatively recently, just 5 years ago, the end of privacy. We have seen and heard privacy as being dead over and over and over again in the media. It is a very common refrain. I told you that I really do like learning from history to try to understand the future of privacy. And as we are going through this digital revolution, the information revolution, I want to share with you just an observation about the Industrial Revolution. Coincidentally, the Industrial Revolution started in Manchester, England. Remember, Alan Turing helped to develop some of the theories which resulted in the first computer code, which was run at the University of Manchester in Manchester, England. So both the Information Revolution and the Industrial Revolution trace their genealogy back to Manchester, England. In the late 1700s, the Industrial Revolution emerges in Manchester, England. The rise of factories, of mills, of mass production changes society significantly. There were disruptive technologies, to be sure. The rise of steam and coal-powered engines changed things phenomenally. This painting, which is the Fighting Temeraire being hauled away for scrap, is, I think, one of the more compelling pieces that describes this era. Oops, sorry, let me pop back. Hang on with me here. Here we go. This piece by J.W. Turner, the noted British artist, hangs in the National Gallery in London, England, and it is called the Fighting Temeraire. The Fighting Temeraire being hauled away for scrap. And what is the piece? Well, it is really a postcard of a moment in time. It's in the early 1800s. The Fighting Temeraire was Nelson's flagship in the Battle of Trafalgar. It was the best of the sailing ships in the British Navy. It was the flagship of the British Navy. The Fighting Temeraire, however, by the early 1800s, had been made obsolete by steam, by coal-powered engines. And so this is the moment in which the Fighting Temeraire, that icon of the British Navy, that flagship of Nelson in the Battle of Trafalgar, is being hauled away up the Thames to be scrapped. It is being towed by a steam tugboat. And you can see the smoke belching out of the smokestack on this boat. J.W. Turner, I think, is capturing here not just this historical moment, but also the emotion of the moment, the fact that there is turbulence and emotional turmoil associated with it. Even though geographically it's not quite right, the sun is setting. So there is a sun setting in this piece. The Temeraire is a ghostly white, while the tugboat in front of it is sort of a silhouetted black. There is an emotional tension to this piece. And in fact, when we go through these revolutions, whether it's an industrial revolution, whether it is a digital revolution, there is a process through which we go through a disruption, a turbulence, a changing of what was to an emergence of what will be. And this piece captures that moment perfectly. I think that that is where we find ourselves today. Think back to the Industrial Revolution. We moved from agrarian societies to more urban and manufacturing-based societies. We saw the rise of so many social changes, things like a common weekend, the idea of a childhood, public education, the idea of women's rights and women actually working outside of the home, in fact, led to the rise of women's suffrage and women having the ability to vote. We saw the rise of workplace safety, child labor laws, environmental standards. And in fact, we haven't fully resolved many of these concerns. Labor concerns, workplace safety concerns, environmental concerns are all hangovers from the Industrial Revolution. They are societal issues that we are still resolving today. The Industrial Revolution changed society significantly and changed society forever. So too is the digital revolution changing society currently. It is disrupting what was, and it is giving us a sense of what will be. Okay, I mentioned that the second Apple was going to be about Alan Turing, and I talked a little bit about him at the start of this chapter, but I haven't really closed the story up. So let me do that for you now. I shared with you the idea that Alan Turing was the father of computer science, that in the 1940s and 1950s, he was the brain behind much of what has given rise to the digital revolution. In so many ways, the current privacy issues that we struggle with today trace themselves back to some of the brilliant thinking of Alan Turing. Here's the privacy connection to Alan Turing. Alan Turing was not just a brilliant scientist in the 1940s and 50s. He was also a gay man. He was a homosexual at a time when being a homosexual was illegal. It was a crime in the UK. And through a violation of his privacy, a reported break-in into his apartment, his sexuality was exposed, and he was given a horrible choice between chemical castration or imprisonment. Alan Weston chose the castration. However, soon thereafter, he committed suicide. This great mind was snuffed out, was gone from us forever. And what other amazing things could he have come up with? And the connection to an apple, and this is a memorial to Alan Turing that I visited a couple of years ago in Manchester, England. The connection to an apple is that Alan Turing was reported to have committed suicide by eating an apple laced with cyanide. So the Apple connection here is strong, and the privacy connection is strong yet again. All right, so now we have explored the first two apples. The first apple is the fundamental human truth of privacy. The second apple is the apple of revolution. It is the apple of the information revolution, the digital revolution, and the connection to the industrial revolution. The third apple is Apple. The third apple is actually Apple, but Apple as a metaphor, as a symbol, as an example of where we may be headed in the future. So let's explore that a little bit. But let's start with an exploration of why we care so much about this issue. And I'm going to go back to history to tell you why I think we care so much about privacy. Jeremy Bentham was a political theorist in the early 1800s, famous for giving rise to utilitarianism. He also famously created a design for a prison called the panopticon. Pan, all, opticon, seeing, the all-seeing prison. And how was it an all-seeing prison? Well, it was circular in structure. The cells were on the outside perimeter of the circle. They were open to, with bars, the center of the prison, and there would be a guard tower standing up through the middle of the prison, through which a guard may or may not be watching at any one time, but the prisoners would never know when the guard was actually watching because they would be behind thin windows or thin openings in the guard tower. The panopticon had a theory behind it, and that was, and this is the important part, observation changes behavior. Let me say it one more time because I think this is so absolutely critical to understanding the connection between privacy and our fundamental human rights. Observation changes behavior. Jeremy Bentham theorized that if guards could watch prisoners, and if prisoners felt that they were being watched, that their behavior would be modified, they would be better behaved prisoners. In fact, that design has carried on for centuries. This is a modern prison design, which is actually still very common. And it is the panopticon. It is exactly Jeremy Bentham's theory. In fact, one of the only reasons that prisons have gone away from this style of architectural design is the rise of a technology. It is the rise of CCTV and cameras. So, observation changes behavior. We care about privacy because when we are being observed, we are not fully acting in a free way. We are not self-determined and autonomous in our decision making. And in that way, privacy very much is the fountainhead of many of our civil rights, of our human rights. Now, we have talked a lot about technological innovation and disruption. And certainly the idea of the velocity of change is one of the things that challenges us greatly today. I like to describe that as the bleeding edge of technological innovation. And then there is a trailing edge of our social normative values and our legal responses. And between those points in time, between those points, there is a risk gap between the bleeding edge of technological innovation, where privacy is being disrupted, where new technologies are emerging that are challenging our understanding of privacy, and our ability to understand exactly how those change our understanding of privacy, and then how we might want to respond. There is risk between those 2 points. And here's the big message: we are in that gap all the time right now. We are always in that gap. And let me describe the risks of that gap again through history, in fact, through a myth, and that is the myth of Diana and Actaeon. Some of you may know it. It's in Ovid's Metamorphoses. Diana is a goddess, goddess of the hunt, goddess of the moon. She is in the forest at a glade with her nymphs, her attendants, and she is bathing. Diana, given her great beauty, is seen by a hunter, Actaeon, who is immortal. He's out hunting with his dogs. And when he finds Diana and her great beauty with her nymphs in the woods, he stops and watches for a while. However, Diana, being a goddess, when she discovers Actaeon, her vengeance is swift. And what does she do? She splashes water on Actaeon's head. Where the water hits his head, he grows antlers. He's turned into a stag. And given now that he is the quarry that he previously sought, his dogs go after him and tear him to bits and kill him. So what is the moral of this story? Violate privacy, get killed. And I think it's a really powerful message. I think it's a really powerful message for all of us today. Many, many, many stories of Diana and Actaeon are in the media every single week right now. We see privacy violations, we see concerns associated with privacy. Sometimes it's the government biting back with fines. Sometimes it's individuals biting back by creating their own privacy protecting responses. Here's a great example from an artist in Berlin. This artist created a piece called My Little Bit of Privacy. And what he was trying to do was say, hey, I've got a studio on a street in Berlin and people keep walking by my window and looking in as I'm working on my art. I want to protect my privacy. So what did he do? He wrote a little bit of code. He got a camera with a motion sensor on it. He got some motors that ran a curtain along a track so this could happen. So individuals want to protect their privacy. Sometimes they have to take it into their own hands. Here's an artist who has created facial recognition defeating devices. And in fact, we saw that in the yellow umbrella protests in Hong Kong recently, that Hong Kong protesters were trying to find ways to outwit the facial recognition. These masks were actually on before the COVID-19 crisis. So this is an image from 2019 in which protesters were actually trying to defeat facial recognition. When individuals feel like their privacy is being invaded, like data is being collected from them unnecessarily or inappropriately, they react. They try to protect their privacy. And while Nicholas Roy may be doing it in the form of a curtain going back and forth in front of his studio, or these Hong Kong protesters may be doing it in the form of wearing masks and goggles to try and defeat facial recognition, know that we do it all the time in terms of trying to protect the data that we're sharing, the way people can observe us. But it's also true that the law can bite back. So not only can individual citizens and customers react, but so too can the law. Let me quickly tell you the story of Alistair McTaggart. He is the activist who was behind the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, the most restrictive privacy law in the history of the United States. Here's the story really quickly. Alistair McTaggart is a wealthy real estate developer in the Bay Area. He was holding a dinner party, beer and pizza apparently, at his house. He was chatting with an engineer, a friend of his family's, someone who was at this party, and making small talk with him, and said to this engineer who worked at a Silicon Valley company, "Boy, your company must have a lot of data about me, huh?" And reportedly, this engineer responded, "You have no idea." And Alistair McTaggart took that and responded by creating a group of academics, of activists, and others that put forth the ballot initiative that resulted in the California Consumer Privacy Act. It looked like it was going to make it onto the ballot in 2017, 2018. Alistair McTaggart then negotiated with industry, and in the course of 1 week, the bill was introduced, passed unanimously by the Sacramento House, Sacramento Senate, and signed by the California Governor, Jerry Brown, at that time, into law. And we now have the most restrictive privacy law in the history of the United States. The law absolutely fights back. We have seen it in the enforcement actions against Facebook. It is just a year ago that Facebook faced a $5 billion, agreed to a $5 billion fine, $5 billion with a B, billion-dollar fine for privacy violations. The law absolutely bites back. There is a moment where Diana splashes water on the head of privacy violators, and there are severe consequences for those that do not effectively manage privacy within that risk gap that I've described. Interestingly, we're seeing something change in the media, and that is that there is a sense that privacy is fighting back. There is a moment in which privacy is retaking ground that perhaps was lost or challenged or disrupted. In fact, The Economist last year talked about GDPR and European regulators and described it as the determinators. And while it wasn't on the cover, this was the headline of the article referenced on the cover. It's not the death of privacy, it's the power of privacy. That brings us back to Apple. Apple famously, after the San Bernardino terrorist attacks, refused to open the encryption, the security solutions on the iPhones of the terrorists behind those attacks for fear of creating a mechanism through which anyone's privacy could be violated. Apple over and over again now has identified privacy as a human right. In fact, they say it in one of the opening screens to a recent operating system update. You can see in the second full paragraph there, Apple believes privacy is a fundamental human right. We have gone from privacy being something that is described as dead to something that is fighting back and something that is actively embraced and used as a basis for competitive differentiation in the marketplace. What a distance we have come. But I do want to highlight the fact that in today's COVID-19 crisis, we're actually seeing the same rhetoric. This is a story from the New York Times back in March. As coronavirus surveillance escalates, personal privacy plummets. Now, they didn't say privacy is dead, it's plummeting here, but it's pretty close, isn't it? I actually don't think that's quite right. I actually don't think that's quite right. This is an infographic that the IEPP created where we started to document all of the privacy issues that were emerging and being debated and negotiated in society. And as you can see, there are dozens of privacy issues. You can find this on the IEPP website at IEPP.org, whether it is contact tracking through Bluetooth or location, information, whether it is immunity passports, green cards for who has antibodies and who does not, whether it is new worlds of work from home privacy, where the boundary between personal and professional space has essentially been obliterated. I'm speaking to you from my own home. This is my study behind me. You are getting information about my personal life just by seeing into my home, which, as we know from Peter Jahook, is otherwise a private space, or expected to be a private space. We don't know the answers to all of these privacy issues yet, but we are negotiating them actively. And so I like to say that privacy is not dead. It's being renegotiated. It is being re-understood in a new and broader way, given the more complex environment that we have, which gives rise to the question, what do you do? What do you do as an organization? How do you manage this? Well, let me start with, first of all, there is no silver bullet. There's no single widget or technology or solution that you can buy that solves it all. There is no master phenomenal privacy statement that you can write that will address all of the issues that you will face. After 20 plus years in this field, after working as a privacy lawyer and expert and leading the IEPP for many years, I am convinced that the absolute best solution to this, the absolute best way to manage the risk in that risk gap so that your organization can innovate effectively, can embrace new technologies and do it in a privacy protective way, is to have smart people in the right places making good decisions. That means that anyone who touches data needs to understand privacy in the digital revolution. Anyone working in the information economy, which is to say about everybody today, needs to be smart enough that they don't create unnecessary risk for your organization. At the IEPP, Mark mentioned we have over 50,000 members around the world. We are only 38% lawyers, so we're not a legal profession exclusively. Significant parts of our membership are lawyers, but we find that our members come to us from all across organizations, from a full breadth of people working in the information economy. And that is because privacy is an issue across the enterprise. So do not think that you can build a privacy team, that you can create a privacy program or policy and have it sit in a bubble inside your organization. Actually, on the contrary, privacy needs to be understood and embedded across the full enterprise. Now, as privacy gets more complex, we are seeing it grow massively. We currently have over 50,000 members in 120 countries around the world, but to give you a point of reference, just 3 years ago, we had 25,000 members. Make no mistake, privacy is an issue that is growing. And yes, the economic situation associated with the COVID crisis will slow us down a little bit, but there is no question that the digital economy will continue to drive privacy issues in the future, and we will see significant growth in this profession in the years ahead. In fact, we did a survey just last year on the number of data protection officers under GDPR in Europe. We actually went to all the data protection authorities and we asked them, how many registered DPOs do you have? And organizations represented an estimated 500,000 data protection officers in Europe. We were able to document 385,000 of them and then extrapolated to those data protection authorities that did not respond to come up with a 500,000 number. That's a lot of professionals working in this new field. And so, in conclusion, I want to wrap up with just a description of what I think we have learned today, and I want to share with you, hopefully, a powerful message about the future. First of all, Privacy is a fundamental human truth. It has been around since the dawn of human society. The first apple is that fundamental human truth. It goes back to Adam and Eve, for gosh sakes. Genesis has ideas of privacy baked into it. So privacy is an ancient human truth. It is fundamental to our humanity, and regardless the technology, regardless the era, we find manifestations of privacy in every single human society around the world. So the first human truth, privacy has never gone away. It's never died. It's always been here. The second apple was the apple of revolution. The idea that there are these massive changes in societal structure that occur largely on the basis of technological disruption. The Industrial Revolution with the rise of steam and coal power, with the rise of manufacturing and mass production, the information and digital revolutions with the rise of computing power and then digital capacity in the internet, the World Wide Web. Those revolutions create massively disruptive moments in which everything that was done before needs to be re-understood in a new era and rethought, and we need to address the new disruptions that have emerged. Those moments can be destabilizing, they can create massive challenges for organizations, and they certainly create risk. The third apple was the apple of Apple, but it's the future of privacy, and that is one in which privacy has real consequences. Certainly, historically, for Diana and Actian, Actian suffered the fate of violating privacy, but so too have we seen enforcement actions, individual reactions by consumers and citizens to privacy, and also a vision of the future for using privacy as brand differentiation, a way to differentiate yourself from the rest of the marketplace because you are generating trust with your customers. And finally, the idea that in order to do this well, there's no silver bullet, there's no widget. You need smart people in the right places making good decisions. So there they are, the three apples of privacy. Privacy is a fundamental human truth. Privacy emerges in the disruption associated with societal revolutions, and that the future of privacy is not one of privacy dying, but rather one of privacy being renegotiated and embraced differently, lest we fall into the consequences that we have seen in the marketplace so far. The three apples of privacy, I think, are really powerful. But let me wrap it up with this, which is that I don't think privacy ever dies. In fact, I know that privacy does not die. So the media is wrong when they tell us that privacy is dead or that it has plummeted or that it is dying. In fact, what we see is that privacy is negotiated. And in fact, I love this image. It's actually from an IBM ad for Watson, their AI system. And in this ad, they were showing that Watson was being utilized in the Sick Children's Hospital in Toronto, Canada. And at Sick Kids in Toronto, they were saying that they were able to gather some number of data points per second, per minute from children in the neonatal intensive care unit, analyze that data, and in analyzing that data, create better results for the children who were in intensive care. In fact, data was saving lives. The advertisement had data emerging from the body of this child, of this infant, and creating a mobile above the child's head, which was rotating and delighting the child. I think this is the best message for all of you. You are the guardians of trust of the information economy. Your job is to make sure that data serves us, that data helps to create better outcomes for our health, for our well-being, more efficiencies in our society, more wealth for all of us. And we need to do that in a way that generates trust with the technologies that we use, with the systems and companies and governments that we engage with. You are the guardians of trust of the information economy. That is a massive, massive job. And it's also one of the most important jobs that we could possibly have at this moment. And as we come out of lockdowns around the world associated with the COVID crisis, we are going to be grappling with many of the privacy issues that I showed on that infographic from the IAPP. And we're also going to still be grappling with all of the other privacy issues that have emerged from the information economy. Those are not going to go away, and they're going to continue to accelerate. We at the IAPP support people who do that incredibly important work, who help to create trust in the digital economy so that these technologies, so that our data can serve us. That's a tremendously big job, and I'm deeply honored to speak to all of you today. I'm deeply honored and supportive of the work that you do every day, and we at the IAPP are here to help, and we certainly look forward to that. And with that, we will call it a close. I want to thank you all for this opportunity to give this virtual keynote, and I hope someday to see all of you in person. And that's a wrap. Thanks so much.